First of all, my sinuses are pretty bad right now, so I'm kind of stuffy and my throat's a little scratchy, so I apologize about that. So we will be discussing the spinal cord and spinal nerves. So the spinal cord obviously is part of the central nervous system along with the brain. Remember, any bundles of axons outside the CNS we call nerves. So, of course, they are part of the PNS. They're not actually inside the spinal cord. The spinal cord is a pathway that sensory and motor nerve signals between the brain and the rest of the body travel. So, sensory is going to be going up the spinal cord to alert the brain. Motor is the response of the brain, so that would be going away from the brain back down the spinal cord to the appropriate effector tissues. The spinal cord is responsible for reflexes, which are the quickest reactions to stimuli. Reflexes for most people are a predictable response, and we'll talk about a few different types of that. So everything extending inferior from the medulla oblongata of the brain until you get to around the L1 vertebrae is considered part of the spinal cord. So there are portions of the spinal cord. The structure which marks the end of it is called the conus medullaris, and that's at L1, which is why whenever they do spinal taps or an epidural, they will always do that below L2, and they don't want to damage the spinal cord. The cauda equine or cauda equina equine is horse, so it looks like a horse's tail, essentially. And so those contain the nerve rootlets, which extend underneath the conus medullaris, and then can go to the buttocks and leg regions from there. Extending a little bit lower, you have what we call the filum terminale. That is a small amount of pia mater that helps to anchor portions of the spinal cord correctly to the coccyx. So the conus medullaris, of course, ends at L1, but the spinal cord has the pia mater around all of it. So just the rest of the pia mater stretches, and that just helps everything stay in place better. So in the picture here, there's a few different things. Some of these we'll be talking about earlier. So of course you see how they have the spinal nerves divided into the different portions, which of course we name based on the vertebrae that they're extending from. So again, the conus medullaris at L1, it's going to be our cone shaped. That technically marks the end. Then again, you have this bundle of spinal nerves that continue after. Those are the cauda equina. And all along the spinal cord, you have the pia mater. Okay, so the pia mater continues to stretch, and it ends right here. So that's just going to help hold all the other portions in place. So the spinal cord is protected by basically the same structures that protect in the brain. In fact, the meninges that surround the brain are continuous with the spinal cord. So instead of cranial or facial bones, of course, we have vertebrae that are hard protective. Then you have the dura mater. So between the two, you have an epidural space. And in the spinal cord, there's actually tissue there. We'll talk about that. Between the arachnoid mater and dura, you have another space, the subdural space. Between the arachnoid and the pia, you have the subarachnoid, which of course, remember we said that's where CSF is found. So epidural space, we already said where it's found. This is where blood vessels can travel to go to specific portions of the spinal cord. Adipose tissues here, which helps cushion. Whenever they do anything that's numbing epidural, this is where they're going to inject it. Okay, obviously where blood vessels to get in the blood, and basically the tissue there, they're going to start to numb. The dura mater actually stands for tough mother. It's the most thickest, toughest of the cranial meninges, so it helps add stability and, of course, protection to the spinal cord. And so it just kind of fuses and connects with the other connective tissues that actually surround the nerves. If you remember from chapter 22, remember the epineurium is the outermost connective tissue that bundles and protects nerves, so it would fuse with that. The important part here, a lot of this we already talked about, again, the subarachnoid space, that's where we have CSF. So CSF is going to help cushion and protect the spinal cord, just like it protected the brain. So just like again with the brain, the pia mater is the most delicate of the meninges, and it's going to directly adhere to the surface of the spinal cord. So it's going to help support blood vessels, essentially, that are, again, serving the surrounding areas. We then have bands of connective tissue. They're called denticulate ligaments. And these basically attach to the dura mater. They help make sure the spinal cord is anchored on the sides to, again, hold it in place. Okay, so here, of course, we have, this is our spinous process, so that would mean the posterior. You see this area with fat, that's our epidural space, and that's really helping to cushion the spinal cord. You can see some of the tiny extensions of the arachnoid mater. So in this area right here, that would be our subarachnoid space. And then basically the white that's directly adhering, that would of course be the pia mater. This shows, of course, the meninges. So toughest, you can actually tell in this picture, that would be the dura. It's kind of a translucent, again, spidery look. That's the arachnoid. And then the innermost is our pia. Remember in this picture, how we tell posterior is that we have to look for the dorsal root ganglion. So because that's on this side, I know that this side is my posterior or dorsal portion of the spinal cord, and that would make this side my anterior or ventral. So we're looking at the spinal cord. It has gray and white matter. So of course the gray matter is very internal. Okay, it makes up this kind of inner kind of butterfly shaped area. And we get very specific about the specific parts of gray matter. So where, of course, again, here is our dorsal root. So that makes this the dorsal or posterior side. So this is going to be my anterior or ventral side. So in this area right here, this is our anterior horn. And the color coding here on the side is showing you what neuron cell bodies arise in each area. So the anterior is motor. So the anterior being motor, here we have somatic motor neurons that arise. Remember, somatic is voluntary. So it's trying to show this here. Again, they're going to start in your anterior ventral root, and then the axon of the neuron is going to extend through the ventral root, okay, and exit out the spinal nerve. And the lateral horn, so that's this kind of side area, that's where the other motor portions will come from. So if it's not somatic, it has to be autonomic or visceral. Okay, so these are things we do not consciously control. And they still exit out the ventral root. Okay, but as we see here, their cell bodies start in that lateral horn, and then they'll come out and exit. So in the posterior horn, that's where we're going to have the sensory neurons dropping off. And most of the time you're going to have an interneuron. That's where the interneuron cell body will be. Okay, so remember, our sensory come in. It's a unipolar neuron. Their cell body's in the dorsal root ganglion. The axon's going to extend. It's going to drop off. And then our interneuron or association neuron cell body starts there. So then it will either drop off in the lateral horn if the motor's going to be visceral or autonomic, or it will drop off in the ventral horn if it's going to be controlling a skeletal muscle. Sometimes things can cross over. This is going to be in the gray commissure. So an interneuron can cross over to the other side. Primarily, though, these are going to be unmyelinated axons. Just like we discussed with the brain, most things will actually wait and cross over in the medulla oblongata of the brain stem. So white matter is the tissue that surrounds the kind of butterfly-like shape of gray matter in the spinal cord. And same thing, white matter is made of myelinated axons that are carrying information to the brain if it's sensory, or back down the spinal cord if it's motor. We divide the white matter into columns, which we call, each one's called a furunculus. So each basically section we're going to see, you're going to have both ascending or sensory axons and descending or motor axons. And of course, these axons are within the CNS. They're part of the spinal cord. That's why we call them tracts. So this is all white matter, everything outside of there. And so you can kind of divide it into these three regions for this white matter, for our tracts to go down. So we have pathways that communicate between our central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, and all the nerves that emerge from there, the PNS. So conduction pathways travel through the white matter of the spinal cord. So of course you're talking about myelinated axons. So again, these tracts will extend towards the brain. This is terminology from the last test. I could ask this again, of course. So we call them nuclei or nucleus when you have collection of neuron cell bodies within the CNS. So again, sensory pathways are going to be moving up towards the brain, so they're also called ascending. Motor pathways are going to be going back down the spinal cord towards glands, skeletal muscle, cardiac, or smooth. So we call those descending pathways. So the conduction pathways, again, most, we've talked about this, cross over or decussate from one side to the other. So in the spinal cord, when this happens, or in the brain really, we call it a contralateral relationship. So basically, the control of skeletal muscle is a contralateral relationship because you have neurons in the right side of your primary motor cortex controlling the muscles on the left side of the body. Ipsilateral is when you have a relationship on the same side. One example, we'll look at the eyes. Some of the information from your left eye will actually cross over and go to the right primary visual cortex in your right occipital lobe. Some of it, though, from the left eye will actually stay on the left side and go to the left primary visual cortex. So when it stays on the same side, that would be an ipsilateral relationship. Okay, so again, sensory or ascending pathways are going to carry information about how you're feeling, okay, what you're sensing. So anything about proprioception, I think position. So telling you what position your body's in. So you're thinking about receptors that are going to tendons, ligaments, joints, muscles. Okay, all of that would give you information about if you're standing, sitting, etc. Just simple touch, temperature. We do have separate hot and cold, pressure, and then pain. Pain are what we call nociceptors. So somatosensory pathways specifically carry stimuli from the skin, muscles, or joints. Again, muscles or joints are going to be, that's our proprioceptors. Viscerosensory pathways process stimuli from viscera. So these are internal organs. So maybe if your stomach hurts or you feel the urge to urinate, or you're breathing in really cold air and your chest hurts. Okay, that would go through the visceral sensory pathways. So I by no means expect y'all to memorize any of these specific pathways. It's pointing out 3 here. We will talk a little bit about one specific. The only thing I want you to kind of notice here is that blue are going to be sensory or ascending. So this is taking information towards the brain, where you see the red areas, that's going to be motor carrying it back down. And once again, you see on the anterior ventral side, mainly motor, okay, where the dorsal side is sensory. Of course, the lateral portions have both. So we have spinal cord pathways. They're a route of communication, again, between the CNS and the peripheral nervous system. So you have peripheral nerves, for example, in your hand. Okay, so when you feel sensation there, they have to connect to the spinal cord, which then also carries the information to the brain. Excuse me. So two general pathways based on the direction of nerve signal. So again, we have the sensory or ascending pathways that are going to take information to the CNS, and then motor or descending that take it back down. This is really the only one that I will specifically ask you about, so I just kind of picked an example of one for us to look at. It's a motor pathway or descending. So of course the information's going from the brain back towards the muscle. This is what we call a corticospinal tract. Okay, so the information originates in the cerebral cortex, and then it's taking it through the spinal cord. So this one is controlling muscle. So the part of the brain that controls muscle, remember that's our primary motor cortex, which is in our frontal lobe. And you see a few different things here. First of all, of course, the axons that are controlling the muscles, you decide to do a movement, it knows exactly what muscle is going to contract. So this would be the cell body. Okay, again, neuron cell bodies are in gray matter. This is your myelinated axon that's traveling through the cerebrum, through the thalamus, going through the brainstem, and the medulla oblongata. Remember, most things cross over. So here it will, and this is what's actually interesting, some information will cross over in the medulla oblongata. Some information will stay on the same side. And then we can see that it can actually cross over in the spinal cord. However, what you notice here, this would be considered a contralateral response regardless, because we're talking about muscles on the right side of the body, and this is your left primary motor cortex. So that is an opposite relationship. Okay, so if we review what type of neurons these are, these are going to be interneurons or association neurons, okay, because they're completely within the spinal cord. Okay, they're in the brain, and they're going through the spinal cord, or excuse me, completely within the central nervous system. Then they're going to drop off. They're very small here, but you can kind of see them. The interneuron or another association neuron. That could be your blue. And then the purple are going to be the motor neurons. And again, you'll see it's skeletal muscle. So they're going to be arising from our anterior or ventral root, the cell body. The axon extends to the ventral root and will go to the muscle. Skeletal muscle, again, is voluntary. So these are somatic motor neurons. So direct pathways, like we just saw, are responsible for conscious control of skeletal activity. So it's going to be somatic. And where we control skeletal muscle, of course, again, is the primary motor cortex. Indirect pathways are responsible for basically anything that you're not conscious. Okay, so if you're not conscious of, we're still talking about motor activity of skeletal muscles here. Okay, but we're not necessarily always conscious of those movements. So if an insect is crawling on your skin, okay, and you kind of withdraw or jerk, okay, that's something you do subconsciously. So just like we saw anything controlling autonomic, which of course is subconscious control, is in the brainstem, these will actually be in the brainstem. So these can send messages to the neurons in the primary motor cortex, and they can modify that. Okay, so spinal nerves are formed from motor and sensory axons. So they have motor and sensory function. Therefore, all spinal nerves, we're going to say, are mixed. So we discussed this again. Let's just review. So the ventral root, again, we have motor. If it's a somatic motor neuron, it's going to be in the anterior horn. The axon is exiting out the ventral root. Okay, so the ventral root carries motor information. Of course, if it's a visceral motor, maybe controlling the smooth muscle in your bladder wall, remember that the neuron cell body is going to originate from your lateral horn. It will still come out the ventral root. And I'm just going to go ahead and talk about the next portion, the sensory. Sensory neurons come in. Again, it's unipolar. They're neuron cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglion. And then they're going to drop off in my dorsal horn. So I may or may not have interneurons. A lot of times I will, and again, or association, and they would be connecting my sensory and motor pathways here. So what we're looking at, again, is the spinal nerve here. We have both motor and sensory fibers that are going through there. So it's mixed. Put on that. Okay, so because the spinal cord, again, ends at the conus medullaris at L1, the extensions of the roots, again, we call that the cauda equina, those have to travel through the lumbar, sacral, and of course all the way to the leg regions of our body. So it's basically going to keep traveling downward. Everywhere where we see these spinal nerves coming out, if you'll look really carefully, it's the space between two transverse processes. So we call that the transverse foramina. Okay, so that's where each spinal nerve emerges from. So in the cauda equina, they will just continue down until it's the correct intervertebral foramen, and then they will extend over. Dermatomes are specific segments of skin that are supplied by a spinal nerve. So spinal nerves we're going to talk about them, but we have 31 pairs. They're, of course, named same way that vertebrae are named, C1, T1, etc. All of our spinal nerves, except the very first one that we call C1, is part of a dermatome. So we have this map. And not that you're going to have to memorize the map, but if someone has lost sensation in a part of their skin, by using this map, we can find out where the spinal cord potential damage was. So what is involved with dermatomes is what we call referred visceral pain. So you may have pain from an organ that's not necessarily really close to where that organ is on the dermatome. So kind of the idea that if you're having a heart attack, you could have pain radiating through the left arm. That's what we would call referred pain. Okay, nothing's happening to your left arm, but that's where you feel the sensation. Appendix, we actually feel around, we call the T10 area. That's not where the appendix is. However, when you go in the doctor and they'll kind of ask you some questions, and that's a very common symptom. Okay, so we're not memorizing this. Okay, but again, these are the dermatomes. So like C5, what you'll see goes all the way down the arms. Some of these have very small areas. So it's just kind of interesting where you feel pain and things like that. Spinal nerves, we have 31 pairs. Again, they're all mixed, meaning they have sensory and motor axons. They're attached to the spinal cord through roots. So the anterior, again, anytime you hear anterior, you're going to think motor, so that's where your motor axons are. The posterior root will have your sensory axons. Of course, we already mentioned the dorsal root or posterior root ganglion. We can divide these roots into branches, or what we call rami. So the anterior rami is going to extend from the spinal cord towards the lateral and anterior front portions of your body. posterior is going to go backwards. So basically, posterior rami nerves will supply deep muscles and skin, anything posterior to the spinal cord. Anterior rami has to go everywhere else. Okay, so we're looking here from the spinal nerve, which again would be mixed. This is our posterior ramus. So again, it's just going to go to the muscle in the skin, posterior to the spinal cord. Anterior, a lot of times you'll see two little anterior rootlets here. So again, these are going to eventually branch to all the structures, lateral organ, skin, muscles, lateral to the spinal cord, and then eventually, of course, make their way in front to the anterior portions as well. So the anterior roots are much more extensive. A nerve plexus is a network of interweaving anterior rami of the spinal nerves. So sometimes you can have, so if these are your different spinal nerves, I can have anterior rami that connect from several different areas, and that's going to form my nerve plexus. They're designed to be a safety net. So basically, if I happen to damage the spinal cord here, I still have several nerve rootlets that are going to be controlling a particular area. Okay, so not all the activity, whether it's motor or sensory, will be lost there. So we discussed these plexi in lab. So we have 4: cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral. Okay, so again, these are your actual spinal nerves. Okay, so we have C1 through C5 here. Again, notice how the anterior rami kind of unite and form this network of nerves that are going to serve a single area. Okay, so the cervical plexus is formed from C1 through C4. It's going to innervate anterior muscles of the neck, a little on the lateral as well, skin of the neck, and parts of your head and your shoulders. Brach refers to upper arm. So the brachial plexus is formed by the remaining portions of your cervical and the first thoracic. So it's going to serve your upper limb, your arm, and your pectoral girdle, the upper chest portion as well. So notice around the thoracic region, we do not have a plexus. Okay, so each nerve T1 through T12 will just follow the rib and serve the structures just around that nerve. So then in the lumbar region, L1 through L4, we have the lumbar plexus. This is going to be located along, I don't know if y'all remember the psoas major muscle, which kind of goes kind of deep belly button to part of your upper part of the pelvic girdle. And it innervates basically your anterior thigh. Okay, so one of the main muscles there, the quadriceps femoris. Sacral plexus is going to be the remaining lumbar through most of your sacral, S4. So that's going to innervate your butt region, the pelvis. Perineum is the area basically between genitals and the anal area, posterior thigh, and then the remaining portions of the leg and the foot. Of course, from the sacral plexus, that's where we have the sciatic nerve, which is the largest nerve of the body. Okay, last thing we need to talk about are reflexes. So again, reflexes are a very rapid, involuntary response. Because you're not necessarily aware that this is happening. And because it's rapid and involuntary, essentially, if you are healthy, you should have the same reflex as other healthy individuals. So we are already responding through a reflex before we're consciously aware of what's going on. So it's a survival mechanism. Okay, so if you put your hand on a hot burner, you don't want to have to wait for the sensory information to go to your brain telling you that it hurts, overheat, because those are precious seconds where you're damaging your hand. Okay, you naturally want a reflex to take over, and you already want to be withdrawing it as you're starting to be aware of that sensation. So we have 5 different components of the reflex arc. These are basically, if you just think about the pathway that a nerve impulse would travel into the spinal cord and out. It's going to be those components. So the receptor is where we have the response to the stimulus. Okay, so a stimulus again could be a hot burner, it could be stepping on a nail. That information is going to travel down the sensory neuron, okay, towards the CNS, so towards your spinal cord and brain. Where in the CNS, that's where we're going to process, interpret, analyze what's occurring. And of course, as we're analyzing in a reflex, we're already responding. Okay, so part of our brain is interpreting what's going on as we're already responding as part of that protective nature. So the motor neuron is leaving the central nervous system. So it's going to go to the effector, okay, the muscle or gland that's going to bring about the response. So again, if you put your hand on a hot burner, the receptors we're talking about would be in your hand. The effectors would be muscles of the arm, okay, to allow you to jerk back your hand to remove it from that stimulus. Okay, so here we see the components. So here, naturally, like if you get pricked, okay, that pricking, that's going to be a stimulus, so that's going to go down the sensory neuron. It's going to take the information to the interneuron. So basically here what we see is the sensory neuron already takes it to the which takes it to the motor, which is going to your biceps, which is going to allow you to withdraw. As you're withdrawing, the interneuron also is going to link to other interneurons going up sensory tracts, making your brain aware, okay, of the sensation. Okay, so there are several ways that we can classify a reflex. So if the processing center is just in the spinal cord, okay, if the information for the reflex does not go up to the brain, then it's a spinal reflex. If the brain is processing the information, then it's a cranial reflex. Pretty much for cranial reflexes, these are just going to be structures around the head. So if the reflex involves muscles of your head or face, like blinking, squinting, tearing up in your eyes, things like that, that would be cranial. Anything that's involving hands, arms, limbs, things like that will be a spinal reflex. Somatic means the effector is going to be a skeletal muscle, so that's voluntary. Any effector that's not skeletal muscle, so a gland, smooth muscle, or cardiac would be considered a visceral reflex. So withdrawing your hand from a burner. If the doctor is hitting your patellar ligament, you kick out your leg. Those are both examples of somatic reflexes. Visceral reflex, after your bladder's being stretched, it's going to contract. Okay, that's a visceral. Mono versus polysynaptic. Mono is one. So you have one synapse between the sensory neuron and motor neuron. So you basically have one synapse, so that's one area. You know, if we go back and think of synapses from the last test, that's one area where you're having to release the neurotransmitter, wait for it to bind to the other receptors to continue the response. So it's going to be more rapid. Then poly is many. So you at least have one interneuron. So you're going to have the synapse between the sensory and the interneuron, and then the synapse between the interneuron and the motor. And of course, you would still have the synapse between the motor and the effector, but we're not talking about this here. The more interneurons that are involved, the more complicated the polysynaptic reflex is, and the longer the response time. And then, of course, we already talked about these terms. So ipsilateral is when your stimulus and effector is on the same side of the body. So if I'm putting my left hand on a hot burner, okay, I'm going to stimulate my left biceps brachii to withdraw my left hand. Versus if I'm walking and I step on a nail with my left foot, I'm actually going to make my right leg contract, so that will allow me to withdraw my left foot from that painful stimulus. So that would be a contralateral reflex. So we're just going to talk about a few specific reflexes. This is a spinal reflex. It's the stretch reflex. So a muscle contracts into being stretched. So inside of your muscle, the receptor, you have a muscle spindle. So as you're stretching that, it detects that you're stretching it. If you overstretch a muscle, you could damage it. So it's a protective reflex. So basically, when you start to overstretch a little bit, that muscle's going to contract. Okay, in this case, we're stretching the biceps. Okay, so the biceps is going to contract. Well, for my biceps to shorten, which is on the anterior portion of the arm, my triceps on the posterior has to relax to allow it to stretch so it does not tear. So you have two things going on basically. The reciprocal inhibition basically makes the triceps relax so your biceps can contract. Okay, so again, we're talking, this is just the spinal cord neurons that are involved, so it's spinal. What is contracting? What's the effector is skeletal muscle, so it's somatic. This is the simplest type. It's an example of monosynaptic. And it's on the same side of the body. If I'm stretching my left bicep, it's going to be my left bicep that's going to contract and my left triceps that will stretch. Golgi tendon reflex is when a muscle relaxes in response to excessive contraction. So this is a great technique to use if you feel like you have a muscle that won't relax. You actually want to force it to contract for several seconds. And naturally, after it contracts, it's going to receive the signal that the calcium needs to go back in the SR. So, of course, that will make the muscle relax. Withdrawal reflex, talked about this already. Like if you put your hand on a hot burner, a muscle contracts to withpull from a dangerous stimuli. In this case, it's pain, so the receptor we would call be a nociceptor. So both of these are also spinal reflexes. They're involving only the spinal cord, skeletal muscle, so they would be somatic as well. So we can use reflexes as diagnostic tools. Again, you should know exactly the response you're going to get with a reflex. So if someone gives you an abnormal response, then that means that there's damage to the nervous system or possibly the muscles that need to bring about the response. So two basic types of responses here. So if someone has a basically low response to the reflex or they don't respond at all, we call that a hypoactive reflex. So that can indicate that that particular portion of the spinal cord where the reflex pathway would go through is damaged. So maybe the person can't, maybe they can sense the pain, okay, but they can't carry that information to the spinal cord. Maybe they can send it to the spinal cord, but something's wrong with the muscle, so they can't actually, the effector, to bring about the change. Or there's something wrong with the communication, okay, telling the muscle that it needs to contract or relax. An hyperactive reflex would be a excessively strong reflex. Sometimes you can have clonus with this, which basically means if you, for example, put your hand on a hot burner, you're going to withdraw it and keep jerking it back and withdrawing it several times. So that indicates more serious brain or spinal cord damage versus just a possible little segment. One of the specific ones you may see in a movie, they'll go on the bottom of, and you're going to laugh at my little picture. Not very good, but they'll go on the bottom of someone's foot and they'll kind of get something sharp with the back of a reflex hammer and they'll do this kind of move. The normal response should be curling of the toes. If you flare the toes, we call that Babinski sign. That indicates brain or spinal cord damage. It's an abnormal response.